Welcome to Crying Out Cloud, the podcast that will make you laugh, cry, and reconsider all of your cloud security fears. I'm Eden from the CTO team at Wiz, and I'm here with my amazing co-host, Amitai.
Hello.
And his cat, Suleiman, behind him. And today we have a very special guest, Chris Hughes. Chris is a seasoned IT and cybersecurity expert. He is the co-founder and chief information security officer at Acquia, and drawing on his extensive background as a U.S. Air Force veteran and former civil servant in the U.S. Navy and General Services Administration's FedRAMP program. In addition to all this, he has extensive experience in the private sector consulting, is an adjunct professor in cybersecurity, the co-host of the Resilient Cyber podcast, and co-authored the book Software Transparency, Supply Chain Security in an Era of Software-Driven Society. Welcome, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for that warm introduction. I'm excited to chat with you all.
We are too, and we're very excited to jump into this. Where are you today? Where are you calling us from?
I'm in Virginia Beach, Virginia, so on the East Coast of the United States.
Lovely. Okay. So we like to do this thing when we start. It is a speed round of questions to get to know you before we jump into the juicier cyber stuff. Okay, are you ready?
I'm ready.
We heard you're into your fitness routine, so we wanted to know, what workout did you do this morning?
This morning was a lower body workout, so back squats and lunges and things of that nature.
Amazing. And are you a person who eats breakfast? If so, before or after your workout?
So yeah, I definitely have to eat breakfast. If I don't, I become hangry, as they call it. But definitely after my workout, I try to get up pretty early in the morning and sneak out before the kids wake up and, go get some movement and activity in, and then come back and hang out and have breakfast with the family.
Amazing. Love it.
Do you measure that activity with a smartwatch? Are you like
I
a Garmin guy?
Yeah, I do actually have one on right now. I've just started using it though. Honestly, I used to have kind of a G-Shock watch, a non-smart watch, and I almost miss it. Like, because this one gives you notifications on texts and emails, and I'm like, I just want to disconnect. Maybe I'll go back to the old watch.
Yeah, and G-Shock is like the cool watch you have like in high school that shows like bigger the watch, the stronger you are.
Yeah, I just like it simplistic. It's not connected to anything. Sometimes a dumb device is a good device.
Yeah.
That's a good quote. Okay. We started this thing called the Crying Out Cloud Hackin' playlist. And so all of our guests help contribute a song to it. So our question to you is, let's say you're like pulling up on Capitol Hill to talk about cybersecurity. What music are you listening to?
That's a tough one. Lately, I've been actually listening to a lot of an artist called Zach Bryan. It's like a country kind of artist, a more modern country artist. And one of your guys' employees, Scott Piper, is a fan of him as well. So I got a chance to go see him in concert last year, and he's got some great songs.
Oh, next question is, are you a Mac, Windows, Linux, or typewriter kind of person?
Typewriter. Definitely, a Mac user. I was a longtime Windows user. I think because the government, tended to have Windows devices, and I couldn't make the switch. Once I made the switch to Mac, I don't think I can go back. It's just smoother. It operates better. It's, native Linux. It's a little bit easier to work with in the cloud and command line and things like that. But given my commentary about the dumb device, maybe a typewriter is calling my name.
Yeah, I think when I was asked whether I wanted a Windows device or a Mac device, I was afraid a Mac would be like a handicap as someone who grew up with Windows. But now I see all my other coworkers using a Mac, and I'm like, maybe it's time.
I'm telling you, it's better, man. You gotta give it a try.
It's time. And for our last question, how did you get into cyber? Was it something that intrigued you as a kid, or were you placed there in the Air Force and the rest was history?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I was always interested in computers growing up, and like I would build them and tinker with them, but it was for the purpose of like, playing games or using the internet basically. I didn't know much about cybersecurity, and I got put in the career field through the Air Force. Kind of started off, in system administration, actually help desk, and then system administration, networking, and then cybersecurity. And over time, I kind of realized like everything is connected to these things, and everything is vulnerable, and it's pretty fascinating. And just kind of rest is history at that point.
I would love for a second before we fully jump into kind of our deeper questions, if beyond how we described your CV, if you would tell our listeners how you would describe your role today and kind of the work that you do day in and day out.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of wear various hats. I'm pretty involved in the community, but one of those hats is the president of a cybersecurity consulting firm known as Acquia. We're a few years old and focused on, heavily on the public sector, but we do private sector consulting as well, in all areas of cybersecurity, like, application security, cloud native security, DevSecOps, software supply chain, things of that nature. And before this role, before taking on the president role, I was the CISO of the company as well. And I find myself, as a president of the company, juggling a lot of hats. It could be HR issues, it could be hiring people, trying to build a great team, trying to go out and, grow the business and get new work. And then obviously interfacing with other security industry leaders and peers in the organizations that we work with, advising them and consulting and kind of giving guidance around emerging topics of interest for them. But outside that, like you mentioned, I contribute to various industry groups like Cloud Security Alliance and CNCF and some others with white papers and research. I've published a book on software supply chain security called Software Transparency. I'm actually working on a second book with Wiley as well called Effective Vulnerability Management. That one will be out in May of 2024. So that one focuses really deeply on, kind of modernizing the vulnerability management practices and the way we do vulnerability management. I co-host a podcast called Resilient Cyber. So you can find me there typically on Fridays on LinkedIn Live, kind of having conversations just like this with other folks in the cybersecurity community. So yeah, I do a little bit of everything, and I think we have an awesome community of folks out there.
Do you enjoy podcasting?
I do. Originally I started it. I'm a bit of an introvert by nature, but I wanted to chat with people and learn from them. Because they all have cyber such a vast field, right? So I wanted to chat and learn. And I was like, I might as well just record these and share them. So I just interview people I'm interested to learn from, and I just record it and share it. And it's kind of been cool because I've chatted with we've recorded like 110 episodes already in the last few years. So we've chatted with a lot of people, and now over time I've realized like I'm 1 to 2 degrees of separation from most people in the community, because I've either chatted with someone that they know or ran into someone that they know in some capacity. So it's been a great opportunity to get out there and just engage with folks and chat and learn.
Yeah, it's also probably a very good way to give platforms to people who might not have them otherwise, and you I guess because you have 2 degrees of separation from them, now they have 3 degrees of separation from everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. We, obviously we seek out like industry leaders and things like that, but we've chatted with people in the public sector, private sector. We've chatted with people from academia, people new to the career field that just broke in and they're trying to navigate like, what the hell, what do I do from here? What pathway should I take? So yeah, we've chatted with folks from all different walks and backgrounds of life, and it's been an awesome, kind of awesome experience.
Tapping into that, you've done a lot of work with both the private and public sector and had exposure to both quite deeply. What surprised you about security in these two very different, but also very similar sectors in the private versus public?
Yeah, I think a couple of the biggest differences that jump out is the private sector, it's kind of the incentive structures and the way they operate, the two different kind of worlds. In the private sector, there's a big emphasis on speed to market and getting new capabilities out and, competition and kind of beating out the competition. In the public sector, there's a much more emphasis on being mission driven, a focus around the mission, whether you're dealing with like veterans care data or Medicare and Medicaid or the DoD and national security systems. There's a much more emphasis on the mission of the systems and the organizations that you're working with, and it's just a scale. Obviously there's large private sector companies, but some of these public sector organizations are dealing with data for over half of the United States population and things like that, or the most sensitive and kind of underserved communities in some cases, or mission critical national security workloads. So the difference is often the focus, of profit and revenue versus mission orientation is kind of the big differences between the two. And for better or worse, and often in the private sector, you can move very fast and break things and learn and iterate. And in the public sector, it's often kind of very cumbersome and bureaucratic and heavy-handed around policies and processes. And some of these things haven't been updated in years or even decades. And you find yourself asking, like, why are we doing things this way? Like, this doesn't even make sense. And it's like, well, the policy says, and it's like the policy's, 14 years old. It's like, all right, sometimes it can be frustrating as well.
Do you think the policy, like at the end of the day, is it a good thing that it exists? Like, does it make it more foolproof as a system?
There's a dichotomy or a double-edged sword there. For one, on one hand, the lack of policy would mean like everyone's just kind of Wild West. And I've seen environments where everyone's just doing whatever they want, and there's no governance, there's no security, and things are moving fast, but they might be moving fast in a bad direction, really quickly. But at the same time, that policy can give structure, it can give organization and kind of standardization around how an industry or sector does something, and it can be beneficial in that way. But the challenge is it always struggles to keep pace with the rate of innovation and technological change. You're doing things that don't make sense sometimes with the technology or the new ways of working. So I think if we could address that lag, that kind of minimize that lag time between innovation and the policies that govern it, I think it would be much better. And I think a good way to go about doing that is like making sure that technologists are involved in the policy and process making or advising people who are writing these things. So I think it could be a good thing because governance and structure and bureaucracy isn't necessarily always bad, but it has to keep pace with the technologies and the ways of working and things like that too.
And what about like FedRAMP, and how does that play into this discussion, and specifically like the new changes around FedRAMP and like what they are discussing around modernizing it?
Yeah, I mean, I used to be in a federal role on the Joint Authorization Board as one of the technical representatives on FedRAMP. And FedRAMP's a great example to what we just talked about. So on one hand, if there was no FedRAMP, for folks not familiar with it, it's kind of the program that governs the way the federal government consumes and uses cloud service offerings. If there was no FedRAMP, agencies and federal entities would just use any kind of cloud service they want. There may be an incident, you may be putting patient data in there or national security information in there. It could be bad. But the alternative is, FedRAMP has been around for over a decade now. We have a market of tens of thousands of cloud service offerings, and we have about 300 approved cloud service offerings in the FedRAMP marketplace after a decade. So it's not keeping pace with the demand of the agencies that want to use cloud service, for delivering on their missions and their goals. So yeah, the modernizing FedRAMP memo that you just talked about is promising. It has some pretty promising aspects to it. It talks about different things in terms of leveraging automation to kind of facilitate reviewing cloud service offerings and reviewing the artifacts associated with meeting the security controls. It talks about streamlining the process of reviewing these cloud service offerings and kind of integrating what they call reciprocity, where if I've reviewed, say I'm Department of Justice and I've reviewed this cloud service offering and, I've approved it for use and I feel comfortable with it, it kind of makes that process easier for other agencies to kind of trust my work, that I've done, so that every agency doesn't need to go and redo this thing over and over again, which can be a burden on both the agencies and their resources as well as the cloud service provider, because they have to go through this process over and over with many different customers. So there's some promising aspects to it. It also is talking about using machine readable artifacts for documentation. Typically when we do security, we all live in Excel and PDF and Word documents, but these are static documents that don't live in the pace of the technology that they're overseeing or being, documenting information for. So they're moving towards machine readable artifacts, like things like OSCAL, for folks who have ever heard of that. It's the Open Security Control Assessment Language. So taking a lot of those static documents like Word and things like that and moving it to a machine readable format, that way it can be updated in an iterative fashion and just kind of be kept up to date and be read by machines and APIs and platforms. It kind of aligns with how we see everything going for as code, infrastructure as code, compliance as code, configuration as code, now documentation as code. So it's a great direction that we're headed in. But that said, I think that it's easy to write memos. It's implementation and kind of proving things out in the real world that kind of show the truth or bear the fruit, I should say, of the success. So I'm excited about the memo and the direction, but we'll see where it goes.
What are the sort of criticisms that you've seen towards it so far?
Yeah, I think one is just kind of a broad notion of skepticism. We've seen a lot of promises around innovating this program before improving it, and like it just hasn't happened in many ways. And also, so people are kind of cynical about that. And also, some people don't think it goes far enough. They think that it's still kind of funneling everything through this, kind of bureaucratic bottleneck process that still has this, review involved and kind of these manual activities that have to be done on an annual basis. Some people are kind of frustrated that there hasn't been enough engagement with industry. You have, these people at these agencies making these decisions and driving this process, but it governs an industry of tens of thousands of innovative cloud service providers. People would like to see more engagement with industry and more, kind of taking the recommendations and feedback from industry and having more of a partnership. And it does speak about doing that in the memo. So, maybe that's a trend we'll see change here as well. But that said, implementing these kind of big programs in these large, complex environments is challenging. It's just like it's easy to write a memo. It's easy to be on the other side and kind of critique the people that are running it and say, they don't know what they're doing. They're not doing good enough. Well, if you're on the other side, it can be very, very difficult as well. So I think there needs to be a little bit of empathy and understanding from both industry and the agencies involved. But there's no denying that we need to speed up the government's access to innovative cloud services, for purposes of civic services and veterans care, medical services, but also national security purposes. It has to be sped up.
I think another area that was recently that's, I think, getting a bit of news is the Biden administration released an executive order on the use of AI. So one of the things that they did was they basically said that it's important to manage cybersecurity risks when it comes to AI. What do you think of that order? And do you think that it's doing the right thing, that it's going to bring the industry in the right direction?
Yeah, I think overall it's been received pretty well by industry. It depends on the perspective, right, of the person or individual or organization that are reading it. But it's been pretty well received. I think practitioners on the security side understand the risks of security and privacy concerns around AI and needing to kind of govern it to avoid things like bias or abuse or use for, unethical purposes, for example. And the government is trying to make sure that we put those guardrails in place early so that we can facilitate, secure adoption of technologies like AI. And ironically enough, FedRAMP actually, released a kind of an article saying that they're going to have a role in this because a lot of these AI services are offered via the cloud, through cloud platforms. So they're going to have a part to play in that as well. So I think it is, a good promising aspect to get ahead of it and try to get out there. But there's been some people who have pointed out that an executive order is not law. It's an executive order, so people can kind of ignore it or follow it, if they choose to do so. I think we'll see kind of subsequent legislation come along to kind of iterate, and build on aspects of the executive order. But I think ultimately it's a good thing to try to get ahead of it and try to show that they're, keeping pace with technology and they understand the implications of it and they want to use it for the right purposes and put some guardrails in place to make sure that happens. Like I said, it's going to be kind of to be seen how that all plays out. And then some people, of course, have kind of started to be concerned with the concept of I think they call it like regulatory capture or a regulatory moat, that there's going to be measures put in place that will help the incumbent organizations who are kind of leading the forefront right now around AI further solidify their advantage, against competitors and kind of block out maybe new innovative startups who are looking to kind of compete in that space. And I hope that doesn't happen. I hope we still see thriving competition in the ecosystem.
So those were two exciting releases in the world of kind of more the federal space, but shifting to another area, which you also know a lot about, and would love to hear your thoughts, is talking about supply chain attacks, which also is relevant towards the government and whatnot. But we talk about them a lot in our podcast because we usually have a news podcast and they come up a lot and make the news. And so specifically directed towards your work, working with like CISA's cybersecurity division, you have explored this deeply and would love to hear, how does SBOM adoption prevent supply chain attacks in your opinion? And then also, like, besides SBOM, what other things could minimize supply chain attacks?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked it in that fashion because many debate whether an SBOM could prevent a software supply chain attack. It could help you maybe respond to a software supply chain attack. For example, historically, there's been a lot of lack of transparency around what software we're using. If we think about open source software, how we're integrating it into our products and using these different libraries and components, for example, or if we're using software from a third-party vendor, a Wiz or whomever, right? What open source software components and libraries do they have in their products that we're consuming and using? Just to bring it back to the federal space a little bit, they did have the Cyber Safety Review Board did a report on Log4j, for example, and they found that some federal agencies were spending tens of thousands of hours, collective kind of hours of folks and resources just trying to figure out where it even existed in the enterprise. Like they didn't even know what systems were impacted because they didn't know where it existed. We look at the fact that software asset inventory has been a critical control for, if you look at like the CIS, critical controls, it's been a control for decades or whatever it's been, right? But we just, when it comes to open source, for example, we didn't really understand what we're using or where it exists in the enterprise and things like that, or what vendors are using things that, we're using that may have risk. And I don't want to paint it only against open source software, for example. We've seen some major incidents impact industry leaders like Microsoft that have impacted, millions of people and tens of federal agencies and thousands of private sector organizations as well. So SBOM, I think, just to stick with the SBOM concept, it brings transparency where there's historically been a lack of transparency around what's being consumed and used in our software. Which is really interesting to think it's even taken us this long because, when we consume food or we consume medications, we know what's in them. And it seems crazy to think we would consume them without wanting to know what's in them. But that's what we've done with software historically. And so I think it brings transparency and it can help you maybe prevent an incident if you look and see, hey, we're using these libraries and they're, very out of date, or they're maintained by a suspicious actor from another country that we don't trust, or, they have known vulnerabilities that could likely be exploited in the near future, for example, or known to be exploited. So it can prevent them in that context, but I think it helps more so in the ability to kind of respond to an incident and understand where we're impacted. How do we implement mitigating controls or remediations, for things that we know are going to impact us or have impacted us. And then the other question was, what else can we do around software supply chain security? And I think we've seen a tremendous amount of information. We've seen, Salsa come out of Google. We've seen, even Wiz has a multi-tenant framework around cloud, environments, for example, that, implementing those best practices can mitigate you from an impact on a cloud service provider, for example. So there's a lot of great information out there in terms of what you can do around CI/CD security. For example, there's an OWASP top 10 for CI/CD security. You can, kind of bolster your software development practices and ensuring you're not pulling in vulnerable libraries and you're hardening your CI/CD environment so that if it gets compromised, it doesn't impact, downstream consumers of software from you. So there's a lot of different things that you can do and a lot of best practices. One thing I've been saying is we're kind of best practices rich, but implementation poor. Like we're rich on guidance and all these different resources that we should and could be doing, but many organizations just simply aren't doing them because they don't know where to start, or they're overwhelmed, or they're already juggling, competing demands on other areas of security like zero trust or cloud security and on, right? So I think just starting with one of those frameworks, whether it's, some NIST guidance or Salsa and things like that, and just starting to head down that path, understanding what software we're consuming from vendors or open source software projects and libraries is a good first step to even, heading down the path of starting to implement secure software supply chains.
So basically you're saying that first and foremost, it's a prevention thing. Like it lets you react to things faster. I think one of the things that I always found amazing in a bad way, when it comes to vulnerabilities, is that like a lot of organizations are basically 0 day away from compromise. Like at any given moment, like tomorrow morning, there could be a new 0 day vulnerability, and they have to start running around like chickens with without their heads on, trying to find what they have installed in their environment if they're even impacted. And someone like 10 years ago installed something somewhere and they have no idea where it is. And the prevention thing, you're basically saying like it's more about understanding the reputation of what you have installed. Like, does it come from a quality source?
Yeah, I think, so when we think about vulnerabilities, they're kind of lagging indicators of risk. We know something is vulnerable at that point. There's a known vulnerability associated with it. But there's leading indicators of risk too, like how well is this project maintained? How many people are contributing to it? Where are those people from? How quickly does this project respond to vulnerabilities? And then, flipping it from the open source side to the vendor as well, are they transparent when they have an incident? Do they disclose really quickly that something happened and what they're doing about it? Do they disclose how it happened and what mitigating controls they're putting in place so it doesn't happen again? And there's some great, resources on the open source side, like OpenSSF scorecard. You can go out there and kind of do a hygiene check of a different, repository or project and get some measures around, just the hygiene of a project that you're consuming. So yeah, just having that inventory, like again, going back to the inventory, like who are our suppliers, and from the proprietary perspective, what open source software components are we consuming from the open source perspective, where do they reside in our environment? And then, what are we going to do when things happen? It's not a matter of if it happens, it's kind of a matter of when. And there's also some emerging, methodologies and practices. Like historically, we've done a lot of things like tabletops, which are kind of hypothetical, thought exercises of, oh, if this happens, we'll do this. And it's great to think about that. But there's like, things like security chaos engineering, where you can manually inject an incident of some sort and see how we will respond, not how we would think we would respond or how we talk about how we would respond, but how would we actually respond? And that, I think, kind of prepares you better to actually respond to an incident when it happens versus just kind of speculating in advance and having a stack of documents, incident response plan, business continuity plan, all these things of what you would do, but you never actually exercise them or use them in advance of when you need them. And then, like you said, it becomes a fire drill, running around, scrambling, trying to respond to something.
Another thing we heard that you do is that you work with a bunch of very cool startups. And in a post-COVID world, when I think a lot of things shifted and changed for startups, what kind of does it look like now in terms of the priorities and obstacles that these companies are seeing in terms of like securing their environments, and kind of what are the new frontier of challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things there. I got into the space, just from being out in the community and speaking a lot and writing and engaging with folks. I've been, fortunate to have the opportunity to do some advising for companies. For example, I'm the chief security advisor at Endor Labs, which is a software supply chain startup focused on securing open source software components and showing you, not only where vulnerabilities exist, but what's actually reachable. For example, as we know, we don't build friends when we run a vulnerability scan and throw a 78-page Excel document at engineers or developers and, hey, go fix all these things. So seeing what's actually reachable, what's exploitable, what's known to be exploited or likely to be exploited coming up soon, using things like reachability analysis, what's actually being used in the code. And then also I'm working with another company, software supply chain startup known as TestifySec, and they focus on more on the attestation side of saying, like, here's how the software was developed, here's what systems were involved, who was involved from a person perspective, here's the processes and steps that were followed, so you can kind of have that provenance of the software development process. And in terms of startups, I think they're definitely facing several challenges, like think about the distributed workforce. No longer does everyone kind of come into the same physical facility and sit the same place and use, corporate owned devices that have been issued and hardened. Everyone's kind of using their own devices to access corporate data, and data's everywhere. So that's definitely a challenge. And then same thing on the development front, kind of pulling down whatever they want and using whatever they want for development purposes, or consuming any cloud services that they find are convenient and useful. And there's no governance around that. But these are organizations, I mean, these are challenges that large organizations, enterprise kind of legacy, long-standing organizations are facing too. And honestly, in some regard, the startups may have an advantage in the sense that they were born in the cloud. They were born in this kind of post-COVID situation where they're used to this is always the way they've always worked. This is how it always has been for them. Some of the large enterprise organizations, this is all new, and it's, definitely a shift from the way they operate. So I think they're obviously much bigger. So the scale of the problem could be, it's a lot harder to, secure an environment with 50,000 employees than it is with 50 employees. So the scale of problems is much larger too. So I think some of the big things are obviously supply chain security in terms of what proprietary software are we using, what vendors are we using, what open source are we using, how do we harden our devices, how are we hardening the environments where we put our data, who are we allowing from a partner perspective to connect to our environments. What kind of risk can that pose? And then obviously, in the software realm, we're starting to see a kind of an uptick of, focus on software liability even. Look at, MoveIt, for example. MoveIt Progress Software is facing a class action lawsuit, as part of that. And they're facing liability, concerns around and producing insecure software and products. So we are starting to see a bit of a trend, for software suppliers. If you're a software vendor, for example, showing that you are doing things like following secure software development practices, you are, mitigating vulnerabilities in a timely manner. You do have a vulnerability disclosure program. You're being, transparent and communicating with your customers and consumers. So safe to say there's a lot of challenges in this space, but there's also a lot of innovative companies doing some amazing things and going out and trying to tackle these challenges and help other organizations do so too. So it's a really exciting time.
I think one of the jokes that always comes out, I guess it's a half joke every time that there's a new supply chain attack or a new major vulnerability is, will eventually CISOs be liable for choosing the wrong products. Like if you use Move It again after what happened to them, will you be liable for making a bad decision?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating topic. We saw obviously like the SEC now has charged Tim Brown from SolarWinds, right, for fraud and negligence and making false statements. And like I'm not an expert or a lawyer to kind of speculate on that, but it does kind of cause concern throughout the industry for the CISO community to say, hey, like we're kind of in the hot seat now. We may be facing legal liability for things that we do at our organization. And I think why that's really challenging in particular is anyone who's worked in security from a CISO all the way down to a security analyst, that you can advise, you can recommend, you can do all these things until you're blue in the face. But the business, your peers, your engineers, development peers, your business peers, they don't have to listen to you. You're there to help them make risk-informed decisions. But they don't have to do what you say. So, I think there needs to be some protections as well to say, hey, I raise these concerns, I vocalize these concerns to my business peers, and they didn't take action on them. So, I don't think that only the CISO should be liable in those situations, for example. And then there also needs to be the concept of safe harbor, which we're seeing get some kind of traction in the industry too, which is kind of the opposite end of, software liability is holding you liable for being negligent or not doing your due diligence, right, as a vendor. There has to be some safe harbor too, to say, hey, I did all the things. I did, I followed secure software development framework. I followed CSF, whatever, right? Insert SOC 2, FedRAMP, whatever. I did all the things and I still fell victim. And we see this happen to the most well-adept, well-resourced organizations in the world, the Microsofts, the Googles, and no one's immune to this. They always say the attacker has to be right once. The defender has to be right all the time. So there has to be some kind of protection to say they did their due diligence, they took reasonable care from a security perspective. They shouldn't necessarily be liable at that point because we know that it's impossible to mitigate every threat, every vulnerability, and every concept of risk.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, compliance is only part of the thing. Like you do need to have defense in depth that can't necessarily be defined by frameworks or can't necessarily be measured by, I don't know, by the law.
Yeah, I actually shared an article from my friend Ross Haliak. If anyone follows him from Venture and Security, he has a great blog. And he kind of laid out this table of like these organizations had these frameworks and they all fell victim to an attack. And it's like, the framework.
I've actually been looking for that. I remember reading that somewhere, and I've been looking for that table for months. So thank you for reminding me where it is.
I'll shoot it over to you. It's it's a conundrum because like organizations will always do the bare minimum. If they, say they have to have SOC 2 or whatever it is, they'll always do that, but maybe not more because it's an additional investment, expenditure, and friction on the, development velocity or whatever, right? So they'll always do the bare minimum, and a framework is not going to protect you from, all kinds of attacks. It can help. That's a good foundation in many cases, but it's not, infallible. So I think that's a great point. Like, frameworks are a good first step, and but organizations will only do what they're required to do. So who defines what's reasonable security or what, is sufficient, right? And then from beyond there, how do we ensure that people that have done those things are protected from kind of legal or regulatory ramifications?
This has been fascinating and really, really exciting and interesting to hear your perspective on all these different topics. We have this tradition at the end of the podcast. We call them the podaways, or sometimes take-a-pods, but they're the kind of the takeaways for anyone that was listening. And so we'll maybe let you take a stab at it, which are like, if anyone was listening, what are the main things that they should walk away with, continue to think about throughout their days?
Yeah, I would say, to try to keep it on topic, I would say that, one is that there's definitely a rise in terms of software supply chain attacks and interest from malicious actors, whether it's proprietary software, vendors, open source software. There's also a rise of a lot of great resources out there from NIST and SALSA, or Google, Microsoft, Wiz, many others when it comes to supply chain security to definitely check out and just get started, and head down the path and orient yourself to like, what are the threats? What kind of mitigations can we put in place? And obviously, my biggest takeaway is just stay curious. Like this space is always evolving. So just stay curious, always be out there learning, growing, engaging with people in the community, and you'll be amazed at how much you can learn.
So don't be too curious because curiosity kills the cat.
I hope not. There's a cat right behind you. So
he's not curious. As you can see,
I think he's
done for the day.
Podcast, so yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's all for this episode of Crying Out Cloud, presented by the cloud security company Wiz. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, and remember, unlike your IAM policies, more stars is better. And as always, if your cloud security strategy is making you cry, don't worry, just cry out cloud.
And thank you, Chris.
And thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It was an awesome chat.
This was amazing. It was so wonderful having you on.
Cloud security.